"Dad, it's time for assisted living," my daughter said over Sunday dinner, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind her. I looked at Melissa across the oak table that had been in this house longer than she had. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her. Her smile was careful, rehearsed. Jason sat beside her, staring into his iced tea as if he had already heard every word that was coming next. I set down my fork and glanced toward the living room where my late wife's favorite lamp still glowed softly beside the window. "Assisted living?" I asked. Melissa nodded. "You've been alone for 3 years, Dad. This house is too much for you now. We're worried." Worried. It was an interesting word. People used it when they wanted something. I had learned that lesson a long time ago. "I'm doing fine," I said. "I still mow my own lawn. I drive myself to appointments. I volunteer twice a week." Melissa let out a small sigh as if she had expected resistance. "That's not the point." I noticed Jason finally look up. He didn't speak. He never did when conversations became uncomfortable. Melissa leaned forward. "You shouldn't be here alone anymore." The words hung in the air. I studied her face. This was my daughter, the little girl who used to run through these hallways wearing oversized rain boots, the teenager who cried when she left for college, the woman who now sat across from me discussing my future as if I were no longer part of the decision. I nodded slowly. "You seem to have thought about this a lot." A brief flash crossed her eyes. Satisfaction. "I have." That answer told me more than everything else she had said combined. This wasn't concern born yesterday. This was planning. Careful planning. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Melissa talked about communities, activities, transportation, dining services, and medical support. She spoke with the confidence of someone presenting a business proposal. I listened quietly. I asked a few questions. I never argued. The calmer I became, the more confident she seemed. Eventually dinner ended. Jason carried dishes to the kitchen. Melissa gathered brochures from her purse and placed them neatly beside my coffee cup. "Just think about it," she said. I smiled. "I will." She kissed my cheek before leaving. The front door closed. Their car backed out of the driveway. Silence returned to the house. I stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes. Then I picked up the brochures. Beautiful photographs. Green lawns. Smiling retirees. Bright common rooms. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I walked to the front window and watched the empty street outside. The sun was beginning to set behind the maple trees. 3 years ago, after my wife Eleanor passed away, I promised myself I would never let grief make me careless. That promise had served me well. Because the truth was, this conversation had not surprised me nearly as much as Melissa believed. Over the past few months, little things had begun to feel wrong. Questions about the house. Questions about taxes. Questions about property values. Questions that had nothing to do with my health. I carried the brochures into my study and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside sat a thick folder of county documents, deeds, surveys, and records dating back decades. My fingers rested on the folder for a moment. Then I smiled. Because Melissa thought tonight was the beginning of her plan. What she didn't know was that the property records told a very different story. I did not open the folder that night. Instead, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in the same chair where Eleanor and I used to spend our evenings. The house was quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet people always imagine when they hear about an older man living alone. It was familiar quiet. Comfortable quiet. The kind that settles into the walls after 40 years of family dinners, holiday gatherings, and ordinary Tuesdays. I looked around the living room and saw traces of her everywhere. The framed photograph from our trip to Maine. The quilt she made during a winter storm 15 years ago. The small ceramic bowl near the fireplace where she used to keep peppermints for visiting grandchildren. Nothing about this house felt too large for me. Nothing about it felt unmanageable. Yet over the past 6 months, Melissa had started talking differently whenever she visited. At first, the changes were subtle. She would ask whether climbing the stairs was becoming difficult. She would wonder aloud whether I remembered to take my medications. She would mention stories about older people falling behind on home maintenance. None of it seemed unusual at the time. Children worry about their parents. That is normal. But then the conversation slowly shifted. One afternoon, she asked how much property taxes had increased over the years. Another time she wanted to know whether I had refinanced the mortgage before it was paid off. During a family barbecue, Jason spent nearly 20 minutes walking the property line while studying the fence and backyard. When I asked what he was doing, he laughed and said he was just stretching his legs. I accepted the answer because I wanted to accept it. Looking back, I realized that had been my mistake. The following morning, I woke up just after 6. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as I prepared oatmeal and sliced a banana into the bowl. My routine had not changed much since retirement. Breakfast, a walk through the neighborhood, volunteer work at the community center twice each week, lunch with friends every Thursday. Contrary to what Melissa seemed to believe, my life had not stopped when Eleanor passed away. It had changed. There was a difference. After breakfast, I stepped outside and watered the flowers along the front porch. Mrs. Patterson from next door waved as she collected her newspaper. We exchanged greetings and spoke briefly about the weather forecast. Everything felt ordinary. Yet Melissa's words lingered in the back of my mind. Not because they hurt, because they did not feel spontaneous. They felt practiced, as though she and Jason had discussed them repeatedly before bringing them to me. That afternoon, while organizing paperwork in my study, I found myself remembering another conversation from several months earlier. Melissa had been standing near the dining room window when she casually asked whether I had ever considered downsizing. At the time, I laughed and told her the house was exactly the right size. I remembered how disappointed she looked for a split second before quickly smiling again. The expression had vanished so fast that I nearly convinced myself I imagined it. Nearly. I opened the desk drawer and looked once more at the thick folder resting inside. County records, deeds, surveys, documents that most people would consider boring. Melissa certainly did not know the full story they contained. Neither did Jason. And as I sat there staring at the folder, I began to suspect that their interest in my future had far less to do with assisted living and far more to do with what they believed would happen to this house once I was gone. 2 days later, I received the comment that changed the way I looked at everything. It happened on a Thursday afternoon after my volunteer shift at the community center. I stopped by a small diner a few miles from home, the kind of place where the waitresses know your name and refill your coffee before you ask. I had just settled into a booth when someone called out from across the room. It was Frank Dawson, a retired contractor who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years. Frank carried his tray over and asked if he could join me. We spent a few minutes talking about baseball, rising grocery prices, and the unusually warm weather. Then he tilted his head slightly and asked a question that seemed harmless at first. "So, when are you selling the house?" I stared at him. "Selling the house?" Frank nodded. I figured it must be happening soon. I felt something tighten in my chest. "What makes you think that?" He looked surprised. I thought everybody knew. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Knew what? Frank shifted uncomfortably. Maybe I should not have said anything. I set down my cup. "Frank." He sighed. "A few weeks ago I saw Melissa meeting with a realtor outside your place. They were walking around the property, looking at the yard, taking notes." For a moment neither of us spoke. The sounds of dishes clattering and conversations around us seemed far away. "Are you sure it was a realtor?" I asked. "Positive. I have worked with him before. Nice guy. Drives a silver SUV." I thanked Frank and changed the subject, but my mind never left that conversation. On the drive home, every small detail from the past several months began fitting together in ways I could no longer ignore. The questions about taxes, the questions about maintenance, Jason studying the property line, the sudden concern about whether I should continue living alone. Individually, each moment had seemed innocent. Together, they painted a very different picture. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in my truck for several minutes. The house stood exactly as it always had. White siding, blue shutters. The front porch Eleanor loved decorating every spring. Looking at it now, I felt less confused than I did disappointed. I had spent years believing Melissa trusted me enough to speak honestly. Instead, it appeared she had been planning something without ever including me in the conversation. That evening, I walked slowly through every room. The kitchen, the dining room, the study. Upstairs, I paused outside the bedroom Eleanor and I had shared for more than 4 decades. Some people look at an old house and see square footage. They see market value. They see numbers on a listing sheet. I saw birthdays, Christmas mornings, school projects spread across the dining table, late-night talks with my wife when the rest of the world was asleep. This place was more than an asset. It was the record of an entire life. Before going to bed, I opened the drawer in my study once again and pulled out the folder. This time I did not simply look at it. I placed it on the desk and opened the cover. Inside were documents dating back years. Some familiar, some I had not reviewed in a very long time. As I turned the first few pages, I realized there was one person who could answer questions I had not yet considered. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Thomas Green. And when my longtime attorney answered, the first thing he said made me sit perfectly still. Thomas Green had been my attorney for nearly 25 years. He handled estate documents, property matters, and more than a few situations that seemed simple until they were not. When he answered the phone, his voice sounded exactly as it always had. Calm, unhurried, professional. I explained why I was calling and asked if he had time to meet. There was a brief pause before he replied. Actually, Robert, I was hoping you would call someday about those documents. That sentence immediately caught my attention. What documents? I asked. The property records Eleanor asked me to prepare years ago. I felt myself sit straighter in my chair. What are you talking about? Thomas suggested we meet in person. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in his office. The building had not changed in decades. The same framed photographs, the same wooden bookshelves, the same view of the courthouse across the street. Thomas placed a thick file on the conference table and adjusted his glasses. Your wife came to see me 6 months before she passed away, he said. Hearing those words brought back memories I had not visited in a long time. Eleanor had always been practical. She believed in preparing for things most people preferred to avoid discussing. She never mentioned that, I said quietly. Thomas nodded. She did not want to worry you. He opened the file and carefully slid several documents toward me. She asked me to create a structure that would protect the property from future pressure, manipulation, or forced decisions. I looked down at the pages. At first, the legal language was difficult to absorb. Trust agreements, ownership provisions, restrictions, recorded filings. Then Thomas pointed to a specific section. Your house is not owned the way most people would assume. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Slowly, the meaning became clear. Years earlier, Eleanor had transferred the property into a carefully designed arrangement that preserved my right to live there, control it, and manage it completely. Certain future actions required conditions that could not simply be bypassed because someone wanted a quick sale. Thomas watched my reaction. She was concerned, he said. Concerned about what? He folded his hands. She worried that someday someone might view the property as an opportunity rather than a home. The room became very quiet. Suddenly, I remembered conversations from years ago. Eleanor occasionally making notes at the kitchen table. Eleanor asking detailed questions about county records. Eleanor insisting that certain documents be stored safely. At the time, I assumed she was simply being organized. Now I understood there had been more to it. Did she think Melissa would do something? I asked. Thomas shook his head. She never accused anyone of anything. She simply believed preparation was wiser than assumptions. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. She never rushed to judgment. She believed character revealed itself over time. Thomas continued explaining the documents. The more he spoke, the more I realized Melissa and Jason were operating under a completely different understanding of the property. They believed the future had already been decided. In reality, they were missing critical pieces of information. Important pieces. By the time our meeting ended, the confusion I had felt all week was gone. In its place was clarity. I drove home with the file resting on the passenger seat. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the road ahead. For the first time since that dinner conversation, I was not wondering what Melissa wanted. I already knew. The real question was how far she intended to go before discovering that Eleanor had anticipated this possibility years ago and left behind far more than memories. Over the next week, I decided not to change anything about my routine. I did not confront Melissa. I did not mention the meeting with Thomas. I did not ask questions. Instead, I watched. People reveal more when they believe they are ahead of you. On Saturday morning, Melissa called and asked if she could stop by with coffee. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost unusually cheerful. 40 minutes later, she arrived carrying 2 cups and a box of pastries from a bakery across town. We sat on the back patio overlooking the yard Eleanor had loved so much. Melissa spent the first 15 minutes discussing harmless topics. The weather, her work, a neighbor who had recently moved. Then the conversation gradually drifted where she wanted it to go. Have you thought any more about simplifying things? She asked. I took a sip of coffee. What things? She smiled patiently. The house. The responsibilities. Everything that comes with maintaining a property this size. I nodded as though I were considering it for the first time. Maybe. The answer seemed to encourage her. Over the next several days, brochures began appearing with surprising frequency. Assisted living communities, retirement campuses, independent senior residences. Melissa highlighted amenities with a yellow marker. Transportation services, fitness centers, weekly housekeeping, organized activities. She presented everything as though she were helping me plan a vacation. What caught my attention was not what she discussed. It was what she avoided discussing. She never once asked whether I wanted to leave. She never asked what this house meant to me. She never asked whether I was happy here. The decision itself appeared to have already been made somewhere else. A few days later, Jason stopped by alone. That had become increasingly rare. He offered to help clean gutters before winter and spent nearly an hour outside. From the study window, I noticed him walking slowly around the property again. He paused near the detached garage. He examined the fence line. He even stood near the back corner of the lot, studying something on his phone. Later, while we drank iced tea in the kitchen, he casually asked whether I had ever had the land professionally surveyed. The question was so specific that it almost made me laugh. Almost. Years ago, I said. Why? He shrugged. Just curious. Curious. Another interesting word. That evening, after Jason left, I pulled out the property file again. The survey maps were exactly where Thomas said they would be. I studied them carefully. Every boundary, every notation, every recorded detail. The deeper I looked, the more obvious it became that Melissa and Jason were operating with incomplete information. They had assumptions. They had expectations. What they did not have were facts. The following Sunday, Melissa invited me to dinner at her house. During the meal, she announced that she had already scheduled a tour at a highly rated senior community 20 miles away. She said it casually, as if we had discussed and agreed upon it together. You should at least see it, she said. Jason nodded in support. I looked at both of them and smiled. That sounds interesting. Relief immediately appeared on Melissa's face. For the first time in weeks, she seemed confident, certain, as though every piece was finally falling into place. She had no idea that while she was arranging tours and making plans, I was learning truths that would change everything. The tour was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Melissa called twice to remind me, which by itself told me how important the visit was to her. When the morning arrived, she pulled into my driveway 10 minutes early. Jason was with her. Both of them seemed unusually upbeat. I locked the front door behind me and took one last look across the living room before leaving. Not because I expected anything to change, but because I wanted to remember exactly how confident they appeared that day. The drive took about 30 minutes. The facility itself was attractive. Fresh landscaping, clean sidewalks, friendly staff. The people working there were professional and kind. I had no complaints about the place. The problem was never the facility. The problem was that nobody had asked whether I wanted to be there. Melissa guided me through the lobby as if she were presenting a finished solution. She pointed out activity rooms, dining areas, and outdoor gathering spaces. Jason occasionally added supportive comments. I listened politely. I asked questions. I thanked the staff. The more agreeable I appeared, the more relaxed Melissa became. By the end of the tour, she was practically glowing. During lunch at a nearby restaurant, she finally said what she had been building toward for weeks. I really think this would be perfect for you. I stirred my iced tea and nodded thoughtfully. You may be right. Her eyes widened slightly. Really? Possibly. The excitement that flashed across her face lasted only a second before she tried to hide it. But I saw it. Jason saw it too. He smiled into his coffee cup. Neither of them realized that my answer was not agreement. It was observation. I wanted to see what happened when they believed. They were winning. Over the next several days, the pace increased dramatically. Melissa started talking about timelines. She mentioned waiting lists. She discussed furniture that would fit into a smaller space. One afternoon, she even offered to help sort through my belongings. You have so much stuff, Dad. It might take months to organize everything. The statement lingered in my mind long after she left. Not because of what she said, because of how quickly she was moving. People who are genuinely concerned usually move carefully. They ask questions. They respect hesitation. Melissa seemed to be racing towards something. The following Monday, I met Thomas again. This time I brought additional records from home. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents. Near the end of the meeting, he showed me a filing I had completely forgotten existed. The moment I read it, I understood why Eleanor had been so meticulous years earlier. The document did more than protect the property. It established conditions that would activate if certain future actions were attempted. Legal conditions. Powerful conditions. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Thomas. Melissa has no idea this exists. He shook his head. No. And based on what you have told me, she is making assumptions that could become very uncomfortable. For the first time since this entire situation began, I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the truth was finally becoming visible. When I returned home that evening, I found a voicemail waiting for me. It was Melissa. Her tone was cheerful, excited. She wanted to discuss next steps. As I listened to the message, my eyes drifted toward the thick folder resting on the desk. For weeks, she had been building a plan around information she believed was true. What she did not know was that one document inside that folder had the power to bring her entire plan to a complete stop. Melissa called the next morning before I had finished breakfast. Her voice carried the kind of excitement people try to hide when they believe a long-awaited outcome is finally within reach. She wanted to come by that afternoon to discuss what she called practical arrangements. I agreed without hesitation. By then, I was no longer surprised by anything she said. At 2 o'clock sharp, she arrived carrying a notebook. Not a folder, not a brochure. A notebook, pages filled with handwritten lists and color-coded tabs. She sat at my kitchen table and immediately opened it. I watched quietly as she reviewed schedules, moving estimates, storage options, and floor plans. The level of preparation was impressive. It was also revealing. Nobody creates that kind of plan overnight. This had been developing for much longer than a few weeks. I know this seems like a lot, she said, turning pages. But I wanted to make things easier for you. Easier. There was that word again. I nodded and listened. She discussed timelines extending several months into the future. She talked about organizing possessions, selling unnecessary furniture, and simplifying responsibilities. At one point, she even referred to the house in the past tense before quickly correcting herself. The slip lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. She noticed that I noticed it. For a brief moment, an uncomfortable silence settled between us. Then she smiled and continued. After nearly an hour, she finally closed the notebook. "What do you think?" she asked. I looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where Melissa used to sit doing homework while Eleanor prepared dinner. The same room where birthdays had been celebrated and holiday meals had been shared. So many years contained within 4 walls. "I think you have spent a great deal of time planning," I said. Her smile widened. "I just want what is best for you." I believed she believed that. At least partly. The problem was that what she considered best and what I considered best were not the same thing. Later that evening, after she left, I walked through the house again. Not because I needed reassurance. Because I wanted clarity. I stopped in the study and opened the property file once more. The documents no longer felt mysterious. They felt solid. Certain. Eleanor had left nothing to chance. Every page reflected careful thought. Every signature reflected intention. The following week, Melissa's confidence continued growing. She began speaking as though the transition was inevitable. She mentioned dates. She referenced future conversations with administrators. She even suggested that certain improvements could increase the home's resale value. That comment told me everything I needed to know. For months, perhaps longer, she had been looking beyond me towards something else entirely. Yet what fascinated me most was not her ambition. It was her certainty. Certainty built upon assumptions. Assumptions built upon incomplete information. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees outside my study window, I received an email from Thomas. Attached was a finalized copy of every relevant document we had discussed. I printed the entire package and placed it neatly inside a leather portfolio. Then I set the portfolio on my desk and looked at it for a long moment. Melissa believed she was preparing me for my next chapter. In reality, she was walking directly toward a conversation neither she nor Jason would ever forget. The conversation happened 3 days later. Melissa invited herself over for dinner, and this time Jason came with her. I suspected they had reached the point where they expected decisions rather than discussions. The leather portfolio remained in my study exactly where I had left it. During the meal, the atmosphere felt unusually relaxed. Melissa spoke about future plans with growing confidence. Jason occasionally added comments about convenience, safety, and simplifying responsibilities. They sounded less like people asking for my opinion and more like people preparing to implement a plan that already existed. I listened quietly. I finished my meal. I poured a cup of coffee. Then Melissa finally asked the question she had clearly been waiting to ask. Have you decided what you want to do? I set down my cup. I have. The smile that appeared on her face was immediate. Jason leaned back in his chair, looking relieved. That is wonderful, Melissa said. I know this has been a big adjustment. I nodded. It certainly has. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I stood up and walked toward the study. When I returned, the leather portfolio rested beneath my arm. Melissa looked confused. Jason looked curious. I placed the portfolio carefully in the center of the dining table and sat down again. Before we discuss any future plans, I said, there are some things you should understand. Melissa glanced at Jason before looking back at me. What things? I opened the portfolio and removed the first document. County records, ownership filings, legal agreements, years of carefully maintained paperwork. I met with Thomas Green, I said. The moment I mentioned the attorney's name, Melissa's expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not yet. Uncertainty. I slid several pages across the table. These are official property records. Melissa looked down. Jason leaned forward. Neither of them spoke. The room became very quiet except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I allowed them time to read. One page became two. Two became three. Their confidence began disappearing line by line. Melissa frowned and adjusted the papers. Then she read them again. Jason's eyes moved more slowly. His face gradually lost color. I do not understand, Melissa finally said. That is because you were working from assumptions, I replied calmly. I pointed toward another section. Keep reading. She did. Jason did the same. The silence stretched longer this time. Eventually, Melissa looked up. Nobody ever told me this. Nobody asked, I answered. She lowered her eyes back to the documents. For weeks, perhaps months, she had built an entire future around expectations that existed only in her mind. The records told a different story. The agreements Eleanor had established years earlier protected the property in ways Melissa never imagined. Certain actions required conditions that had not occurred. Certain decisions remained entirely under my control. Most importantly, nobody could simply accelerate the future because it suited their timeline. Melissa sat motionless. Jason stared at the paperwork. Neither seemed interested in coffee anymore. I was not angry. I was not triumphant. Mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that Eleanor had been wise enough to prepare for possibilities neither of us wanted to imagine. As the evening light faded beyond the dining room windows, Melissa slowly closed the final document and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in a very long time. For the first time since this entire situation began, she realized she did not understand nearly as much as she thought she did. Melissa and Jason left shortly after that conversation. Neither of them argued. Neither of them raised their voices. They simply gathered their things, thanked me for dinner, and walked out the front door carrying a silence that felt much heavier than the one they had brought into the house. After their car disappeared down the street, I remained at the dining room table for several minutes. The documents were still spread across the polished wood surface. The same documents that had quietly existed for years while assumptions grew around them. Eventually, I gathered the pages, returned them to the portfolio, and carried everything back to the study. Outside, the evening sky had turned deep orange. The maple trees swayed gently in the breeze. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the week before. Yet something important had changed. The following days were surprisingly quiet. Melissa did not call. Jason did not stop by. No brochures appeared in my mailbox. No discussions about timelines arrived through text messages. For the first time in months, the pressure vanished. I spent my mornings the way I always had. Coffee on the back porch, walks through the neighborhood, volunteer work at the community center, lunch with friends. Life resumed its normal rhythm. About 2 weeks later, my phone rang just before dinner. Melissa's name appeared on the screen. I answered. Her voice sounded different. Not defeated. Thoughtful. We spoke for nearly an hour. For the first time in a very long while. She asked questions instead of presenting solutions. She asked about the documents. She asked about Eleanor's planning. She asked why I had never mentioned any of it before. I told her the truth. Nobody had asked. Then I told her something else. I explained that the real issue had never been the house. It had been trust. The property records had only exposed a misunderstanding that had been growing for much longer. There was a long pause before she responded. I thought I was helping, she said quietly. Maybe part of you was, I replied. But somewhere along the way, you stopped asking what I wanted. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she apologized. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just honestly. It was enough. Over the next few months, things gradually improved. Melissa visited without bringing plans. Jason stopped measuring things with his eyes every time he walked into a room. We shared dinners that felt more natural, more familiar. Nobody mentioned assisted living. Nobody mentioned selling property. The subject simply faded away. One Saturday afternoon, nearly 6 months later, I found myself standing in the backyard looking across the lawn Eleanor had loved so much. The roses were blooming. The fence needed repainting. The bird feeder near the oak tree was crowded with visitors. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. I thought about everything that had happened and realized the house had never been the true victory. The victory was keeping the right to decide my own future. It was being treated like a person instead of a problem to solve. Eleanor understood that years ago. That was why she prepared those documents. Not because she distrusted anyone. Because she believed dignity deserved protection. As the sun began to set, I sat on the porch swing we had bought together decades earlier. The house remained exactly where it had always been. The garden remained exactly where it had always been. And for the first time in a long while, so did the truth.